Coming in at number 10, we have the heart feaster. This is one thing that I will never want in my life, and I am pretty confident that it will never happen to me, and that is sleep paralysis. Being stuck in a state where you can't move as you hallucinate in the dark sounds like something so villainous even Freddy Krueger wouldn't do it. He'd be like, at least kill them after, don't just let them sit there all night, that's gross. Luckily I sleep like a log, so there's no chance anything like that is going to happen to me, but for some others this can happen quite often. When people are stuck in sleep paralysis, it can be something as simple as having the feeling that someone is watching you as you are sleeping, while other people will have the heart feaster. A story online talked about a horrible entity that would come visit someone as they slept. They named this beast the heart feaster because it would lurk into their room when they couldn't move and then it would crawl on top of them. The creature looked like its body was made out of a dark crimson, and it had long fingers that were almost like claws. Its face resembled a demon with a long pointed nose and jagged teeth. While this person was stuck and unable to move, the heart feaster would reach its long piercing fingers into their chest and pull out their heart and start eating it in front of them. Wow.
Next up at number 9 now we have Morse code. This one comes from Confra. He said he once lived in a small building in the middle of his city. He ended up moving out because of a strange man who lived across the hallway. The man mostly kept to himself, but around midnight there was always a strange noise coming from his apartment. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. It was a bumping sound, like someone walking around in heels, but muffled as if someone was trying to keep it quiet. After a few days he realized the pattern was always the same, like a record playing over and over again. It went on for weeks, then months, then almost a full year, always the same bumps for hours at night. It was only years later, living somewhere else, that something clicked. He was helping his daughter with homework. She was learning about Morse code. She knocked on the table with her knuckles and a shiver ran down his spine. He recognized it as the pattern he had heard all those years ago. When he asked her what it meant, she laughed. "That's the easiest one, Daddy," she said. "It's the one to call for help." Moving on to number 8 now, we have Charlie. This one comes from Reddit user Horror in Pure Form. I'm just going to read this one exactly as they wrote it because it really deserves it. "I hate it when my brother Charlie has to go away. My parents constantly try to explain to me how sick he is, that I am lucky for having a brain where all the chemicals flow properly to their destinations like undammed rivers. When I complain about how bored I am without a little brother to play with, they try to make me feel bad by pointing out that his boredom likely far surpasses mine, considering he's confined to a dark room in an institution. I always beg for them to give him one last chance. Of course, they did at first. Charlie has been back home several times, each shorter in duration than the last. Every time without fail, it all starts again. The neighborhood cats with gouged out eyes showing up in his toy chest, my dad's razors found dropped on the baby slide in the park across the street, mom's vitamins replaced by bits of dishwater tablets. My parents are hesitant now, using last chances sparingly. They say his disorder makes him charming, makes it easy for him to fake normalcy, and to trick doctors who care for him into thinking he is ready for rehabilitation, that I will just have to put up with my boredom if it means staying safe from him. I hate it when Charlie has to go away. It makes me have to pretend to be good until he is back." Next up at number 7 now, we have counting. This one was submitted to BuzzFeed. A man said his daughter woke him before midnight one night. He and his wife had picked her up from her friend Sally's birthday party earlier that night, brought her home and put her to bed. His wife went into the bedroom to read to her while he fell asleep watching the game. He awoke to feel his daughter tugging on his shirt sleeve. "Daddy," she said, "guess how old I'm going to be next month?" "I don't know, honey," he said as he slipped on his glasses. "How old?" She smiled and held up 4 fingers. The parents stayed up all night asking their daughter the same question for hours, but she refused to tell them where she got those 4 fingers from. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Guardians. This is a story from Dark Alligator. One day a man awoke to a huge insect-like creature looming over his bed. It twitched and jerked its head, staring right down at him. He screamed and ran out of the room. When he sheepishly came back though, the insect was gone. That didn't make sleeping again easier though, and he stayed up all night night wondering if it was a dream. The next morning there was a knock at the door. He opened it to see one of the huge insects placing a plate filled with food on the floor. It then backed away from him. He ate the food, confused but content. Perhaps this was the beginning of a bizarre relationship? As well as cooking, the creatures poured baths for him and began to tuck him into bed. He began to worry they were fattening him up. After one greasy breakfast gave him heartburn though, they actually replaced it with fruit. It seemed that they cared about him. One night he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. They were protecting him. One morning the creatures wouldn't let him leave his bedroom. He lay down on the bed, confused but trusting them. After hours of lying there, he felt a pain through his body. It felt like his stomach was full of razor wire and it was somehow moving. The insects chittered excitedly among themselves as his pain got worse. It was only when his skin began to bulge that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him, they had been protecting their young. Moving on to number 5 now, we have the sound of silence. This one comes from Reddit user Doverhawk. She said after a lifetime of being deaf, her best friend just received cochlear implants. When he woke up from the surgery, they all stood around him. His wife was the first one to say anything. He heard her voice and at once began to cry. They all took turns speaking, letting him hear their voices and names, and with each word they said, he became more emotional. When they were all finished, silence hung in the room. He looked up at her and asked her what that sound was. It took a moment to understand what he was saying, and when she understood, she told him that he was hearing silence. He shook his head. "This isn't silence," he said slowly, hearing his own voice for the first time. "I've been hearing silence all my life, and this is different." A sound came from just outside the hospital room, and he perked up immediately. "Isn't that silence?" They all exchanged looks of trepidation around the room before she spoke. "No," she said slowly, "that was the sound of someone screaming." Moving on to number 4 now, we have Mother. This one comes from Reddit user Whoever Fights Monsters. She said that when she and her sister Betsy were kids, their family lived for a while in an old farmhouse. They loved exploring the dusty corners and climbing the apple tree in the backyard. Their favourite part was the ghost in the house. They named her Mother because she seemed kind and nurturing. Some mornings she and Betsy would wake up and find a cup of tea by their beds. They felt the ghost had left them there, worried that they would get thirsty in the night. Among the house's original furnishings was an antique wooden chair which they kept against the back wall of the living room. Whenever they were watching TV or playing a game, Mother would inch the chair forward towards them. Sometimes she managed to move it all the way to the very middle of the room. They always felt sad putting it back against the wall as they felt Mother just wanted to be near to them. Years later, long after they moved out, they found an old newspaper article about the farmhouse's original occupants. One of them was a widow who murdered her 2 children by giving them each a cup of poisoned milk before bed. Then she hung herself. The article included a photo of the farmhouse's living room with the woman's body hanging from a beam. Beneath her, knocked over, was the same old wooden chair placed right in the middle of the room. Next up, number 3 now, we have the wallpaper. This one comes from Reddit user BatOutOfHell821. She said that her and her boyfriend once bought an old house. He took control of any new construction that was needed, converting the kitchen into the master bedroom for example. She was on wallpaper removal duty and had her work cut out. The previous owner had covered every single wall and ceiling. Removing it was a real chore, but she got into the rhythm of it eventually. It began to feel satisfying, like peeling off a sunburn. She began to play a game, seeing what the longest piece she could peel off was before it finally ripped. She noticed that under a corner section of paper in every single room was a person's name and a date. Curiosity got the better of her one night and she decided to Google one of the names and discovered that the person was actually a missing person. The name and the date matched perfectly. She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning she made a list of all the names and dates. Her face got paler with each name that matched with a missing person. They called the police, who cornered off the whole area. She overheard 2 of the officers talking in one of the rooms. One said, "Yeah, it's definitely human." "Human?" she asked. "What's human?" "Ma'am," they said, "what you were peeling off the walls wasn't newspaper. We're going to give this all to the coroner." Next up at number 2 now, we have Seeing Dad. This is a great story from the General G on Reddit. Real or not, it's very creepy, and he told it like this. "Every day I see my father at work. He pretends like he doesn't see me, but I know he does. I try to do the same. But that doesn't really pan out well either. When you're at work, you gotta be on top of your game. So I do my best to just get on with what I'm supposed to do and get my job done. I can feel him watching watching me. Good. I want him to see how different I am from him. I'm not in your shadow. I'm my own person. I know what you're wondering. Do others know that he is my old man? Hard to say really. If they don't, I have no plans to correct them. If they do, well, there is nothing I can do about it. We are all under the shadow of our parents for the duration of most of our lives, whether we like it or not. In some cases, it just happens to be more obvious than others. Our parents help us define who we are. It's only a question of whether you follow their example or run as fast as you can in the other direction. For example, if you have a drug abusing parent who happens to murder a newlywed couple that gets stranded on the side of the road when you are only 10 years old, that might make one inclined to perpetuate a similar kind of violence, or it might make you decide to be a prison guard so that you can make sure they and others just like them can't do it anymore, much like I did. And finally, number 1 now, we have Giggle. This is another one submitted to Reddit by a woman who said that one night she rushed out of her house to catch the opening act at her local bar's music night. After a few drinks, she realized her phone wasn't in her pocket. She checked the table that they were sitting at, it wasn't there. She tried the bar, the bathrooms, no luck. In the end, she gave up and decided to use her friend's phone to call her own. After 2 short rings, someone answered. "Hello?" she said. The other end of the line was silent. Then she heard a low, raspy giggle before the phone hung up. The person didn't answer again. She eventually decided to just go home. When she got to her bedroom, there she found her phone, lying on the table by her bed, right where she had left it. Starting off at number 10 now, we have Leave. This one comes from a Reddit user who owes his life to a stranger or some supernatural force. See what you guys think. They say, I was stationed in Seoul, South Korea several years ago. I was taking a shower in my room, and when I got out, the word leave was written in small letters in the fog on the bathroom mirror. I don't have a roommate because we get our own private rooms there. A little freaked out, I decided to do exactly that. I left. I went off for some Korean barbecue and wandered the city a bit. I came back a couple of hours later to find the barracks were evacuated and half burnt to the ground. The fire was pinpointed to faulty electrical wiring that caught some insulation on fire inside the walls. Someone or something knew that was going to happen, and to this day, whatever that something was, it didn't want me in the middle of it. I gladly thank who or whatever it is if they give me the chance, but it's been years and I still have no idea.
At number 9 we have The Stalker. This next story was told by a young boy who grew up in a very old house. He said strange creaking noises coming from all over the home at any time of night was very common, but what wasn't common was something called the stalker. Every now and again he would see something out of the corner of his eye. He wouldn't think that it was anything and he would just go on about his business. That was until he saw it. It was something he called the stalker. He said it looked like the girl from The Ring, but it was on all fours. When he looked at it, the stalker just stayed in one spot for what felt like an eternity. The ghost was locked in one spot until it scampered into another room. He told his parents about it, but he brushed it off and said it was a dream. However, our writer was certain that it happened because he went to investigate the spot where the stalker was, and there were 2 wet handprints on the floor. At number 8 we have a short one. Some of my favorite ghost stories are the short ones. It's impressive what you can do with a few sentences. This one goes like this. I awoke to the baby monitor crackling with a voice comforting my firstborn. As I adjusted to my new position, my arm brushed my wife sleeping next to me. Ooh, that is creepy. Coming in at number 7 we have imaginary friends. You would be surprised how many kids have imaginary friends that end up being ghosts. In fact, I did a multi-part series on Most Amazing Top 10 all about this. One of the most horrific stories I read about this was a young boy and girl used to have the same imaginary friend. It was just a voice that they would hear. It kept telling them to go into the woods behind their home. They would just ignore it and they really didn't think much of it. In fact, they didn't even know that the other sibling was hearing the voice until they brought it up with each other years later. The scariest part about this was when their younger sister, who was just old enough to talk, started saying that she could hear a voice that told her to go play outside in the trees. Ho-ho. Coming in at number 6 we have glowing eyes. A girl was walking home late one night and she can feel something is off. She's not sure what it could be, but she knows she doesn't feel safe. She looks back over her shoulder and she sees a tall tall man in a trench coat who seems to be swaying side to side as he walks towards her. He's about 30 feet away and she can't make out his face except for a massive grin. This is obviously extremely frightening, so this young lady starts to move quickly, but it seems no matter how fast she moves, he keeps gaining on her. Eventually, she starts running and she can hear laughter start to come from behind her. She's now sprinting and looks back over her shoulder to see how close this man is, and the last thing she sees is the man right behind her with his massive eyes that are glowing red. Coming in at number 5, we have grave robbers. This is a pretty famous story about two young boys who wanted to give a scare to their friends. Now, is this story true or is it just an urban legend? It's hard to tell. Apparently, there were two kids who loved to play pranks on people. One day they decided they wanted to play the ultimate prank by digging up a dead body and scaring their friends with it. So they went to the local graveyard in the middle of the night and they started digging. When they finally worked their way down to the body, they started cheering in excitement. The people living nearby heard the noises and they thought that the dead were rising from their graves. They ran and attacked the two boys, mistaking them for zombies. They were both killed and now their ghosts haunt the graveyard. Coming at number 4, we have voodoo priestesses of New Orleans. New Orleans has a long history of voodoo, and apparently there are people who live out in the bayou who have found a way to communicate with the dead. They will talk to the spirits of the dead who have been left to walk the earth without anyone to listen to them. Because these voodoo practitioners have spent the time learning how to talk to spirits, they can command power over them. They can use the dark magic of the dead to cast spells on people, bringing them misfortune. That really sounds like it sucks. Coming at number 3, we have another short one. Alright, we have room for one more short scary ghost story before I hit you with the top 2. I think this one might be my favorite short ghost story of all time, and it goes like this. My daughter won't stop crying and screaming in the middle of the night. I visit her grave and ask her to stop, but it doesn't help. Oh, that gives me goosebumps. Coming in at number 2, we have My Friend in the Basement. A young girl who is about 5 years old moves into a new home with her mom. The two of them love the place, but the mother notices something strange about her daughter. She spends a lot of time in the basement, talking and laughing like there's someone there. Sometimes she'll walk down to check on her to see who she's talking to, and every time there's no one there. One day her daughter comes back upstairs with a bite mark on her arm, and her daughter says, "Richard bit me." Her mom tells her that she is not allowed to play in the basement anymore. Then that night something attacks her daughter in her bed. The mother rushes in the room when she hears the poor daughter screaming. When she finds her daughter, she's still alive, but she has scratch marks all over her body. The next morning the two of them leave the home, never to return. And at the number 1 spot we have the taps. Something that ghosts love to do is turn on the taps and jack up your water bill. If you go online and search for this, you will find countless stories of ghosts who love to mess around with the water. This one was pulled off of Reddit, and it was about a young girl who was living alone, and she was often woken up by the sounds of running water. At first she thought that maybe she forgot to turn off the taps, but it started happening so frequently that she assumed that she was sleepwalking. But then it started happening when she wasn't home. Terrified that someone was breaking into her house when she wasn't there, she called the police. They came to check out the place, but they couldn't find anything. So her next best move was to set up cameras and spend the night at a friend's house. Then she saw it, the taps in the home turning on by themselves. Now it's time to go down the spiritual route and have someone come in and fix the ghost problem. A medium came through to contact the ghost, and it turns out there was a body of a girl who had been drowned in a tub that was in the home, who had been buried under the house. That is spooky.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Red. This one comes from Godzilla on Reddit. He said he once checked into a hotel a few kilometers from Kiev in Ukraine. It was very late and he was very tired. After booking a room at the desk, he was given a room number key. The woman at the desk stopped him as he went up the stairs. "One more thing," she said. "There is one room here without a number on that floor. It's always locked. Don't look in there." He nodded sleepily and headed upstairs, falling asleep instantly on his bed. He awoke though in the middle of the night to the sound of trickling water. It was coming from the room on the other side of the hallway. He opened the door and saw the room opposite was the exact same one that had no number. He opened the door and saw the room opposite was the one that had no number. Ignoring the woman's advice, he banged on the door. No response. He tried again. No response. He looked in the keyhole and saw nothing but red, just a deep, hazy scarlet. The water was still trickling. He went down to the front desk to complain. The woman's face dropped. She told him slowly that there was nobody in that room ever since the murder. A woman was killed in there by her husband many years ago. Her skin was pale, her hair dark brown, and her eyes, when she died, were a red, a deep hazy scarlet. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the figure. When you're a kid and you get creeped out at night, your parents may tell you it's just your imagination. But what if you found out that you were right the whole time? Reddit user Miss Awesomeness said, when I was a kid between 8 or 9, I used to wake up every night to headlights coming through my bedroom window. The lights would then stop and turn off, not as if a car drove by, but as if they were turned off. Then the long shadows of a man, as if he were looking through my window, would pass by and stop right in front of the window. I would lay really still and pretend nothing happened every night for months. Eventually I convinced myself it was my imagination. Now that I think back, it stopped when my stepdad moved in, but I was convinced it wasn't real. Across the street lived my best friend, whose mom was also single, and she refused to sleep in her bedroom. Her window faced my window. She told me years later it was because every night a man would park on her side yard and walk over to my yard. The long shadows were from the light in her yard. She eventually decided it was my dad checking in on us and never told me until I was a teenager. It wasn't my dad, I know that because I asked him, so I thought I was crazy and hallucinating for years, or perhaps I wasn't and 2 kids were having odd dreams at the same time every night. Coming out number 8 now, we have The Room. This one comes from a Reddit user who said, I work in hospice, I spend a lot of time around dying people. About a month and a half ago, one of my longer term clients was actively passing. Now that can involve hallucinating, seeing and talking to people who aren't actually there. It happens a lot. There's nothing wrong with it. It's the dying person's brain trying to grasp with their new reality. So I work overnights. My client was wide awake, talking to people who were in the room with her but who weren't in the room with me, which was fine. I'm okay with that. Until she started describing people I knew who had passed. I almost quit my job that night and told myself I wouldn't return to her. Most of the rest of her hospice care team started quitting in the next few days, and I ended up staying with her until the very end. That one weird night was the only time she was talking to my dead family members. I'm still kind of messed up over it. Next up, number 7 now, we have The Creature. Do you guys believe in Bigfoot? We've talked about that a lot in urban legend videos. Is this story related to that? Reddit user The Glitter Band said, I get insomnia. It was one of those nights and I was sitting out on my back porch at about 4 AM smoking a cigarette. It was one of these eerie nights where there is absolutely no breeze and it's just completely quiet out. We have woods behind our house, and as I was sitting there, I see this person making his way through the canopy of the trees, like jumping from tree to tree, 30 or 40 feet up in the air. I was absolutely stunned and just sat there, dumbly too afraid and confused to even get up and run inside the house. This person or thing or whatever it was stopped directly behind my house and looked at me. At this point it's about 50 feet away and maybe 40 feet up in the air. It pauses for about 5 seconds staring in my direction. I'm absolutely certain that it wasn't an animal. Its body was human shaped and it definitely wasn't a raccoon, bear or any of the other things people might have suggested it was. But the way it was moving through the trees definitely was not human. No human, I don't care how fit they are, could move like that. It was too dark to make out that much detail of the face, clothing or anything like that. After about 5 seconds of looking at me, it turns away and takes off the same way it had been going before, just leaping from tree to tree at a fast pace. Within a few more seconds, it was out of sight. Moving on to number 6 now, we have True or False. This one comes from Reddit user The Ambush Bug. I'm going to jump right into it and we'll discuss it after. They said, in 4th or 5th grade, we stopped all of our classes for the day. 2 people came into our classroom, a man and a woman, and they didn't say why they were there or where they had come from. They handed out questionnaire booklets that seemed like standardized tests, except for the questions within them. 50 or so questions, all of them true or false format, but with really weird content. Some that I can remember were true or false, worms talk to trucks, and true or false, apples are blue. We all answered them while looking really confused, and our teachers were silent the entire time. The next day, nobody said a word about the test. I remember asking people what they were, but nobody could recall where the people were from. We never saw them again, and no faculty of the school ever once mentioned a test. We didn't have them the next year and had never had them before. I still have no clue what they wanted from us. Alright, what is going on there, guys? That sounds like something out of a movie. Like some sort of creepy CIA stuff. Moving on to number 5 now, we have teleportation. Do you guys believe that teleportation can happen? This story makes it sound like you just have to believe really hard to make it happen. Reddit user Evangelina1021 said, I always remember this and do not have an explanation for it. When I was about 4 or 5 years old, I remember waking up in the middle of the night and walking to the stairs. I remember closing my eyes for a second at the top of the stairs, and when I opened them, I would be at the bottom of the stairs. I would run upstairs and close my eyes, and the same thing would happen again. It happened at least 4 or 5 times until my parents called me to go to bed because they could hear me run up the stairs. It's weird because I was totally wide awake and do not have a history with sleepwalking. I still think about it and wonder how that was possible. Next up at number 4 now, we have the boats. This one comes from Reddit user Risa, and if you can solve this mystery, guys, there's a massive monetary reward for you at the end of it. I'm serious, you're about to see why. They said, my uncle never had a chance to meet him, hired a small yacht with a small group of friends and were going to use it to do sailing holidays as a business. Anyway, they radioed in very early one morning saying they were out of petrol off the coast and were told they would receive petrol in the morning. They went to deliver petrol and never found the boat. They have only ever found one life donut ring, and that's it. They think the boat was pirated, and we have reports that they're still alive in different countries, but they've never been substantiated. They also have a sneaking suspicion that the yacht owner had something to do with it, as he acted so dodgy after it all went down. They literally have absolutely no idea what happened. There were no other ships in the area at the time. They thought they could have been run over and sank by a larger ship. Anyway, it's called the Paternailer. There is still a huge reward out for any info. Coming in number 3 now, we have pizza time. This one comes from Reddit user Math the username, who said, I was 18 and my brother Chris was 16. I also have a brother James who was 5 at the time. We had just moved into an older house that used to be 3 apartments. We just about finished unpacking and we designated rooms. James's room was directly above the living room with a staircase. James went up to discover his new room, and Chris and I took a short walk around the neighborhood. We got back and were sitting in the living room just talking. My mom says she's going to get pizza for dinner and leaves. She took a fairly long time, which is normal for her. I think she really enjoys the small breaks she gets when she can leave the house without James, and I never object to babysitting. Besides, James is plenty occupied with his new room. Chris and I are just talking in the living room. James is super excited about his new room. We hear him running and stomping around upstairs, opening and closing doors. Sometimes he slams the doors pretty hard, but whatever, he's a kid. I assumed he fell asleep since the noise stopped eventually. I hear my mom's car pull up. I get up to meet her in the kitchen. My mom comes in carrying soda. James follows directly behind her carrying the food, yelling pizza time. She took him with her to get dinner. Chris and I just looked at each other, taking way too long to comprehend what was happening and what was making that noise upstairs. Next up at number 2 now, we have John. This one is just straight up creepy. If they are telling the truth about the details of this story, then I have no idea what the explanation is. Reddit user CatGib13 said, when my son was about 2 or 3, he wouldn't go to sleep, so I let him in my bed. My husband was asleep, so I told my boy he had to look at his books quietly when I read mine. He was good for a bit, but then he started reading the book, actually reading the words out loud, slowly. Now he couldn't read, and it was never a book we had read to him yet. It wasn't memorization. I asked him how he knew what it said, and he replied, my friend John is telling me. He talked to John whenever he played. He divided his Matchbox cars into 2 piles and talked to his friend. He also claimed he lived in his nursery closet. At age 4, we moved him into his big boy room, and now that he's 16, he refuses to even step into the nursery. He hasn't been in there since we moved him out. When I ask why, he says he doesn't know, but it gives him the creeps and the hairs on his arm stand up even thinking about it. That doesn't bother anyone else. I don't actually know what the explanation for that story is. Maybe the kid could read better than they thought, or maybe the spirit of a dead man called John was reading out loud to him at night. I hope it's the first one. And finally, number 1 now, we have Ernie. Do any of you guys have those toys that talk when you like press a button on them or move in front of them? Did you ever think they could be creepy? Well, you're about to, after this story from Reddit user LXNXB. They said, when I was a kid, I had lots and lots of plushies. One of them was a talking Ernie doll from Sesame Street that wasn't functioning properly. You had to absolutely bang it on a table for it to say, I feel great. Our old house in my home country was housed with spirits, but not bad ones, or at least that's what my parents said. I never witnessed or felt anything until this one time. When I was 8, I overheard my parents saying something along the lines that my Ernie plushie spoke every time they talked about my grandma. I got irrationally scared, which made my parents hide Ernie in a huge box along with my other unused plushies. One time, while I was playing hide and seek, I was hiding with my childhood friend Jay in our spare room where the box of plushies were. While we were hiding, I figured I might as well tell him the story about the haunted Ernie doll and my just recently passed away grandma. In the middle of the story, we hear Ernie say, I feel great, in the box on top of the shelf. There's no way that was moved, and even if it was somehow moved by gravity, you need to bang Ernie on the table to even make it talk. We screamed and ran outside.